Welcome to Flight Lines, the stories behind the stories. And this is the morning coffee edition. I have my Yeti right here and hot cup of coffee. And what I want to share with you this morning is a few of the stories that really exemplifies what pilots love to do. And we love to give rides to young people because many times that's how we started, and somebody was nice enough to give us a ride, and that triggered a whole series of interests and activities in our lives. And a typical request I would get when I was more involved with the aviation program, running it from day to day, um, where people, I want to know about it, and I have a young child that wants to get involved. Now, there was a lady that her family moved into the area, and she wanted to know more about the program. Now, it was between our pancake breakfast, so I normally give rides. We give rides to young people at the pancake breakfast. So it was between the monthly breakfast, and I said to her, "Well, why don't you bring your son Kyle out to the airport? He was going to be a freshman in high school." And we'll talk about airplanes, and I'll give him a ride in my plane and as a young eagle. And so we did that. Now we're up in the air, and what I normally do when we get to be 2,500 feet or so, I let the young person fly the airplane. So I said to Kyle, "Would you like to fly the plane?" He said, "Sure." So my hands are off the controls. He takes the controls, and we are just flying along like he's been this multi-thousand-hour pilot. The transitions left, right, up, down. I mean, smooth, just absolutely smooth. And I'm I'm amazed. And I said to Kyle when we got back down on the ground, and we spent about 40 minutes up in the air. I said, "Now let me get this straight. This is the first time you've been in an airplane, right?" "Yeah, first time." I said, "I mean, you handle this thing like a pro. How did that happen?" He says, "Well, I've got Microsoft Flight Simulator at home." I said, "Ah, there you go." And that's one of the things we often see with our young people when they come to us. A lot of them had experience with the video games, and especially Microsoft Flight Simulator, and the skills were transferable. Of course, the feelings of the airplane are different, but the skill set, monitoring what was going on and the controls were the same. Well, as a teacher in the school district, I get a lot of different requests. And when I was doing that, and I got a middle school teacher I work with, and she said, "I had this young person I'd like to get an airplane ride for." And I said, "Okay, I can do that." Again, it was during the pancake breakfast, so I took Kayla up as her first flight, first time in an airplane. And as I got up to altitude, like I did with Kyle, I said, "Would you like to fly the airplane?" And there was an emphatic no. "I don't want anything to do with it." And there was no matter of persuasion of what I was going to change Kayla's mind. So we went ahead and did our normal thing. We flew over the middle school. We flew over her house, and where she had her paddock, where she had her horse, and all that sort of thing. And then we landed, and I asked her, I said, "Did you have a good time?" And she said, "Yeah, I had a great time." I said, "Well, would you like to do it again?" And she said, "Yeah." So we arranged to meet each other again with her parents the following Saturday at the airport. And then it was just Kayla and myself and her parents. So I get her in the airplane, and I'm about to start the airplane, and she gives me the shot in the ribs. And I'm going, "Oh boy, is something wrong? Is she, doesn't want to fly, whatever?" And I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Well, I want you to do is explain all the gauges and switches and buttons, everything on the panel before we go." I said, "Well, all right." So I went from left to right, and I explained every gauge, dial, button, switch, everything. And so we started the airplane, and off we go down the runway, and she's monitoring the tachometer and the airspeed and the altitude indicator, all this stuff she's right on top of. So we get up to altitude, 2,500 feet, and I say, "Would you like to fly the airplane?" Well, this time she said, "Yes." Okay. Well, Kayla, before you do that, and this is a conversation I've shared with many people and many pilots over the years, and they all relate to it. I said, "Would you like to fly the airplane?" She said, "Yes." And so I said, "Before you do that, you own a horse, right? We saw it from the air." the other day. And she says, yeah. I said, well, when you want that horse to turn left or right, left or right, you just take the reins and lay it over the neck of the horse and you let the horse know what you want it to do. Yeah, yeah, that's what I do. I said, well, guess what? I fly the airplane the same way. I fly with two fingers. I just gently touch the yoke and let the airplane know what I want it to do, whether I want it to go left, right, up, or down. It's very, very gentle. Oh, okay. Well, most people, when they first get into an airplane and they take the controls, they grip that yoke with a death grip. They figure the harder they hold on, the safer they're going to be. Well, what happens is every time they put an input into the airplane, it's a rather severe input. It's not gentle. It's, like this. And so what you wind up doing is you wind up chasing the airplane with your last input, and you're going all over the sky. The trick is to do it very, very gently. And so that's what she did. She started flying. I said, try it with just one hand. And so she's flying with one hand with a couple fingers. And we're doing all these flight maneuvers. We spent 40 minutes in the air and she nailed it. She was doing the altitude changes and left and right, just having a ball. And it was smooth and it was gentle. And the point of this is we all have skills and talents, and a lot of those skills and talents can transfer from one thing to another. Kyle did it with his Microsoft Flight Simulator. Kayla did it with how she handled her horse. And so many times in life, we allow ourselves to get talked into something that's difficult, and it really doesn't need to be because we already have the skills and talents that we can wind up being successful. Last thing I want to share with you, and again, this is another story I've shared many times, and it happened, quite a few years ago. My son, Michael, who's now in his 40s, was 7 or 8, and I had a 152 two-place Cessna, and it was a wonderful little airplane, and I would give my kids rides all the time, and they were quite comfortable in the airplane. But I usually put a booster seat in the right seat so they could see over the panel and out the window. Well, I forgot it for some reason. It wasn't in the truck. And so now Michael and I are flying along, and he said, Dad, can I fly the airplane? I said, sure, Mike. I said, but here's what I want you to do today. And I showed him on the panel where the gyroscopic compass was, and we were in a westerly heading. So there's a big W right there. And I said, I want you to fly the airplane and do a complete circle and come back on that W. And I showed him where the turn and bank indicator was and the altitude indicator. And so I said, I'm going to show you how to do it. So I did a maneuver. So we get back on the W. And I said, okay, Michael, it's your airplane. Now my hands are off the controls. He can't see over the panel and he can barely see out the window. So he's flying on instruments. And as he got into the turn of the airplane, as he turned the airplane, I said, Michael, pull back on the yoke. Just keep pulling back, pull back. And throughout the whole maneuver, I just kept saying to him, pull back, pull back. And he's watching the compass and the altitude indicator. And, he's keeping it in about a 15 to 20 degree bank where I showed him how to do it. And if that little sucker didn't come right smack dab out on the W and didn't lose 50 feet altitude. He says to me, Dad, did I do okay? And I said, Mike, yeah, you did pretty good. I mean, when I took flight training many years ago, I was lucky if I could keep it within 200 or 300 feet of the same altitude as I made the turn. And here's why. Because when an airplane's flying along, the wings are lifting this way, okay? And gravity's pushing down that way. But when you turn the airplane, gravity's still doing its thing. It's still pushing the airplane down, but the airplane wants to lift that way, where the wings are. The wings are lifting this way. Gravity is pulling it down that way. Well, you have to compensate for that. And the way you do is you pull back on the yoke throughout the whole maneuver. That's how you maintain your altitude. Well, again, like I said, he nailed it, and he didn't lose 50 feet of altitude. But here's the thing. Michael didn't know that it was a difficult maneuver. To him, he was just doing what his dad told him to do. Just pull back, pull back, pull back, and just keep flying the airplane. And again, he was flying on instruments and no had no perspective of the horizon, and he just came smack dab back on that W. I just couldn't believe it. And so many times in life, and there's an important life lesson here. So many times in life, we are going to do something and we're told, oh, it's going to be hard or you can't do that. And we talk ourselves out of it. And that's unfortunate because many times we have the skills and talents to do it if we just have the courage to go and do it. And I've told that story to many, many people, and I could see the light bulbs go on. And one of the things that I've enjoyed over the years in another part of my career when I taught public speaking. Public speaking is one of the greatest fears, beyond dying that people have. I think it's number two because they don't want to get up in front of people and they're going to feel nervous. And I would encourage people to say, look, whatever you're going to talk about, you've earned the right to speak about it. You know the subject, you know what's going on. So just have a conversation with those in front of you, whether it's two or it's 200, it doesn't matter. Just be yourself and share a conversation and enjoy it. And give yourself the latitude to have fun sharing what you already know about. And that's the secret. This whole thing will imagine that, they're out there in their underwear or whatever. I mean, that's crazy. Just remember, you've earned the right to speak about it, have a conversation, and you can be successful. Again, just don't let people talk you out of something or talk yourself out of doing something different or new because you think you can't. Henry Ford once said, if you think you can't or you can, you're right. So go and try something new and don't be afraid. So again, this is the session of morning coffee with Flightline, and I hope you enjoyed this and maybe take a lesson out of it or two. But we'll be doing this on a regular basis. There's some short little stories that have a point and maybe something to give you to think about. So thanks for joining Flightline. It's the stories behind the stories with the people who were there, morning coffee edition. Have a great day and God bless.